Harlem, New York. 8:43 p.m., Saturday, the 7th of November, 1931. Inside locked door, one of Manhattan's most exclusive restaurants, and one of the few that had only recently begun admitting wealthy black patrons, the atmosphere was calm, polished, almost serene. White tablecloths, low conversation, the quiet confidence of a place where violence simply didn't happen. At a central table sat Stephanie Street, Clair, 34, known throughout Harlem as Madam Queen, celebrating a profitable week in the numbers business. Beside her was Bumpy Johnson, 26, her protege, enforcer, and sworn protector, along with 3 trusted associates. They talked expansion, edging into territories already claimed by a man who believed Harlem's gambling belonged to him. This was November 1931, before the numbers war erupted into open bloodshed. Tension existed, but public confrontations were still rare. Street, Clair and Johnson felt secure dining openly at locked door. No gangster would risk a scene here, surrounded by affluent white patrons who wouldn't tolerate it. For a moment, that belief seemed reasonable. Then, around 8:45 p.m., Bumpy Johnson excused himself to use the restroom near the back of the restaurant. The conversation at the table continued. 60 patrons dined in quiet confidence. 2 minutes later, the front door opened. Dutch Schultz walked in with 4 men, scanning the room like it was his. His eyes locked onto Street Clair's table. A smile spread across his face, cold, deliberate, predatory. He moved straight toward her, boots echoing in a room that had suddenly gone silent. Chairs stilled. Conversations died mid-sentence. Everyone sensed it at once. This wasn't a chance encounter. Schultz stopped at the table and stood over Stephanie Street Clair, asserting dominance without a word. In that instant, locked door ceased to be neutral ground. The safety Street Clair believed she had this elegant room, these witnesses, was about to be tested, and the mistake she'd trusted others wouldn't make was now unfolding in front of everyone. What followed would ignite a war and change Harlem forever. Dutch Schultz didn't sit. He loomed over Stephanie Street Clair, making sure everyone nearby could hear him. His voice was loud, confident, meant to dominate the room. He mocked her for dining in a white restaurant, using slurs designed to humiliate her in front of the silent patrons. Around the table, Street Clair's associates began to rise, but Schultz's men closed in immediately, hands inside their coats, weapons clearly within reach. The message was unmistakable. Stay seated or die here. Stephanie Street Clair did not raise her voice. Witnesses later said her calm was unsettling. She told Schultz she was having dinner with friends and suggested any business be discussed elsewhere before he embarrassed them both. Schultz answered with fury. He declared that Harlem's numbers game belonged to him now, every banker, every runner, every operation. He accused her of refusing to surrender and of encouraging others to resist him. Then, with theatrical cruelty, he reminded her of what he believed was her place. Great. The restaurant went dead quiet when Schultz produced a revolver and placed it on the table, slowly spinning it so the barrel pointed at Street Clair, then her associates, then back to her. He bragged about the men he'd killed with it, daring anyone to stop him. From only a few feet away, he aimed the gun at her face and asked if she would surrender peacefully or if he would take everything by force. No one intervened. The silence told its own story. Then Street Clair reached into her purse. She drew a small pistol and aimed it squarely at Schultz's chest. Her voice didn't shake. She told him she would never surrender by force or otherwise, and reminded him that being white didn't stop bullets. For several unbearable seconds, guns pointed across a dinner table, while 60 patrons froze, knowing a single trigger pull could turn the room into a slaughterhouse. Schultz sneered and called it a bluff. That's when everything broke. From Schultz's side stepped Patrick O'Brien, his enforcer. In 2 fast strides, O'Brien struck Street Clair across the face, knocking her gun from her hand and splitting her lip. He stood over her, boasting that this was how uppity women were handled. Schultz laughed openly, pleased as blood ran down Street Clair's mouth. And in that moment, with Bumpy Johnson still away from the table, Dutch Schultz believed he had won. He was wrong. Dutch Schultz was still laughing when the laughter died in his throat. A cold, metallic pressure touched the back of his skull, just above the spine. A voice spoke from inches behind him, quiet, controlled, and lethal. "If your man touches Madam Street, Claire, one more time, I will blow your brains all over this restaurant. Drop your gun." Now, Bumpy Johnson had returned from the restroom. He stood directly behind Schultz, close enough that missing was impossible. The barrel of his pistol was pressed firmly against Schultz's head. Schultz's 4 men froze, hands hovering near their coats, unsure whether drawing a weapon would trigger an instant execution. The room was silent again, this time not from fear of Schultz, but from the certainty that death was seconds away. Street Clair remained seated, holding her bleeding lip, staring at Patrick O'Brien with a look witnesses later described as pure hatred. Some patrons slid under their tables. Others sat rigid, eyes wide, understanding that a massacre could begin at any moment. Schultz tried to sound calm. He mocked Johnson, asked if he really planned to shoot a white man in front of dozens of witnesses, asked if he was ready to die in prison for it. Johnson didn't raise his voice. He told Schultz to place the gun on the table and ordered him to tell O'Brien to step away from Street Clair. Slowly, carefully, Schultz complied. O'Brien backed off, confused and shaken, hands raised. Johnson laid out the rules with terrifying clarity. Schultz and his men would leave. They would never threaten Street Clair again. No slurs, no intimidation, no hands laid on her ever. If they did, Johnson would kill Schultz. Not maybe, not someday. He would kill him. Schultz warned that this wasn't over, that Johnson was starting a war he couldn't win. Johnson replied that the war had already started the moment Schultz walked in and disrespected the woman he protected. Then he stepped back, gun still trained on Schultz, and ordered them out before he changed his mind. Schultz stood, gathered his weapon, and looked at Johnson with a mix of rage and grudging respect. He promised retaliation, warned Johnson not to touch O'Brien, and declared that doing so would mean total war. Johnson's answer was simple: "I've been ready." Schultz and his men walked out of locked door under the silent gaze of every patron inside. Only after the door closed did the room erupt, voices overlapping, staff calling police, people realizing they had just witnessed history. Johnson turned back to Street Clair, examined her injury, and urged her to leave before authorities arrived. As they stood, she spoke softly, but with absolute resolve. She wanted the man who hit her found. She wanted him to understand that hitting a black woman carried consequences. Johnson nodded. He promised he would find Patrick O'Brien, and when he did, O'Brien would explain to Dutch Schultz exactly why that night had been the biggest mistake of his life. For the next 7 days, Harlem changed its rhythm. Bumpy Johnson turned the search for Patrick O'Brien into his organization's single priority. Dozens of men were deployed watching bars where Schultz's people drank, tailing known associates, bribing informants, listening for whispers in Harlem and in the Irish neighborhoods where Schultz's enforcers lived. Word spread fast and quiet. Bumpy Johnson was looking for Patrick O'Brien, and he was paying serious money for information. Cash amounts that, in 1931, could change a life. By November 14, exactly 1 week after the confrontation at Locked Door, the tip finally came in. An informant reported that O'Brien would be at a specific bar in Hell's Kitchen that night, meeting men connected to Schultz's gambling collections. Johnson ordered overwhelming force. No mistakes, no escapes. They waited until O'Brien staggered out alone around 11:30 p.m., drunk, careless, walking toward his parked car. In a dark stretch of street with no witnesses, Johnson's men moved fast. Arms were seized. A hand covered his mouth. Within seconds, O'Brien was inside a vehicle and gone. The operation was over almost as soon as it began. He was taken to a warehouse in the Bronx, one used by Johnson's organization for matters that couldn't happen in Harlem. Near midnight, O'Brien was brought into a basement room and forced into a chair. His hands were tied behind his back. 4 men stood around him. At the table sat Bumpy Johnson. In front of him were a pen, ink, and several sheets of paper laid out neatly. O'Brien tried bravado at first. He threatened retaliation. He bragged about Schultz's power. He showed no regret for striking Stephanie Street Clair. Johnson listened without interruption, his face unreadable. When O'Brien ran out of words, Johnson spoke calmly, precisely, and without emotion. He told O'Brien exactly who he was, where he lived, who his wife and children were, and why he was there. Then he explained what would happen next. O'Brien would write a letter to Dutch Schultz in his own handwriting. In it, he would admit that hitting Stephanie Street Clair was the biggest mistake of his life. He would acknowledge that violence against women was cowardice. He would apologize for bringing trouble to Schultz's organization. And finally, he would say goodbye. O'Brien refused. Johnson gave him a few minutes to reconsider. Then he explained the alternative fingers broken, one by one, starting with the writing hand. O'Brien understood. His hands were untied. The pen was placed in front of him. For the next half hour, Patrick O'Brien wrote while shaking, crying, barely able to hold the pen. When he finished, he signed his name and dated it, the 15th of November, 1931. Johnson read the letter carefully. It said everything it needed to say. Then he looked up and told O'Brien the truth. The letter would be delivered. Schultz would read it, and O'Brien would never be seen again. 2 days later, on Monday, the 16th of November, 1931, a sealed envelope arrived at Dutch Schultz's office in the Bronx. There was no return address. The handwriting on the front, however, was instantly recognizable. Schultz's secretary knew it the moment she saw it. It was Patrick O'Brien's. Schultz opened the letter and began to read. As he moved through the lines written in O'Brien's own hand, his face drained of color. The message was unmistakable. O'Brien admitted that striking Stephanie Street Clair at locked door had been the biggest mistake of his life. He acknowledged that violence against women was cowardice. He apologized for bringing trouble to Schultz's organization, and then he said goodbye, wishing Schultz a long life, while making clear he would never be part of that business again. Within minutes, Schultz made a call to O'Brien's home. His wife answered. She had already reported Patrick missing. Schultz didn't need a body. He didn't need confirmation. He understood immediately what the letter meant. Bumpy Johnson had taken O'Brien, forced him to confess his mistake, and erased him cleanly, completely, without leaving evidence that police could use. It was psychological warfare at its most precise. The letter confirmed O'Brien was dead while proving nothing at all. Schultz was furious, and, beneath the fury, unwillingly impressed. He ordered searches. He offered rewards. He pressured contacts. But no body surfaced. No witness came forward. Patrick O'Brien had vanished from New York as if he had never existed. All that remained was a confession and a goodbye, delivered straight into Schultz's hands. The message spread fast through the underworld. Disrespect Stephanie Street Clair, and Bumpy Johnson will make you write your own obituary. From that moment on, everything changed. Street Clair was no longer just a numbers banker. She was protected visibly, brutally, and without compromise. Johnson's reputation hardened overnight. At just 26, he had proven he did not bluff. When he promised consequences, he delivered them in a way that left no room for misunderstanding. Patrick O'Brien's wife would wait for answers that never came. Police investigations stalled and quietly died, and in Harlem, men who might once have considered harming Stephanie Street, Clair thought again, remembering the letter, the disappearance, and the price that had already been paid. The war with Dutch Schultz was inevitable. But after that letter, Schultz entered it knowing one thing for certain. Touching Harlem's queen carried a cost he might not be able to afford. Patrick O'Brien's body was never found. His disappearance became an open secret in New York's criminal world, never proven, never spoken aloud in the wrong company, but universally understood. In Harlem, the story spread quietly at first, then with certainty. The man who struck Stephanie Street, Clair had paid with his existence. No funeral, no grave, just a letter and a warning. That warning reshaped everything. Men who once saw Street Clair as a target now saw a boundary they could not cross. The numbers war with Dutch Schultz still came violent, relentless, and costly, but one line was never crossed again. Killing Stephanie Street, Clair was considered. It was discussed, and every time it was rejected as too dangerous. The memory of Patrick O'Brien was enough. For Bumpy Johnson, the locked door incident sealed his reputation. At 26, he was no longer just an enforcer. He was a man whose promises carried finality. When he said someone would disappear, people believed him because someone already had. That reputation would follow him for decades, shaping how allies and enemies alike dealt with him. For Stephanie Street Clair, survival was the victory. She continued operating through the chaos of 1932 and 1933, outlasting rivals who underestimated her power and her protection. Elderly Harlem residents would later say that the letter, forced, handwritten, and delivered without a body, saved her life more than once. The night at Locked Door became legend, retold in whispers, then in stories, then in history books. A white bodyguard made the fatal mistake of laying hands on a woman he believed had no protection. A protector returned from the restroom, and a week later, the man who swung the blow vanished forever after writing a confession with his own trembling hand. That was the message Bumpy Johnson sent to New York's underworld in November 1931. Touch the people I protect, and you will disappear, after explaining, in your own words, why it was the biggest mistake of your life. And in Harlem, no one ever forgot it.